The entire trauma wing went dead silent when Commander Derek Voss released his military K9 in the middle of a crowded hospital corridor. 94 pounds of Belgian Malinois, pure muscle, trained to take down armed combatants. The dog launched off the tile floor like a missile, and every doctor, soldier, and orderly scrambled backward out of its path. Every single one, except her. The nurse didn't move, didn't scream, didn't even flinch. She dropped to one knee, opened both hands palm up, and said 4 words so quietly you almost missed them. Shadow, stand down, home. The dog hit the brakes so hard his back legs nearly slid out from under him. The growl died in his throat. His body shook, not with aggression, but with something that looked almost like grief. And he walked the last few feet toward her slowly, pressed his face against her chest, and closed his eyes. 6 Navy SEALs stood in that hallway with their mouths open, because only one person in the world was supposed to know that phrase, and that person had been declared dead 5 years ago. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the stories on this channel go places most people aren't brave enough to follow. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one doesn't end where you think it does. The Harbor Reach Military Recovery Center sat on a bluff above Crescent Bay, Oregon, about 40 minutes south of where the coast highway gave up trying to be scenic and turned inland toward truck stops and farmland. It wasn't a famous facility. It wasn't the kind of place that got written up in military journals or featured in recruiting campaigns. The buildings were functional, underfunded, and perpetually damp from the Pacific fog that rolled in most mornings before 6, and sometimes didn't leave until noon. What it was genuinely known for, in the narrow circles of people who knew it existed at all, was a trauma staff that didn't rattle easily. You had to be a certain kind of person to work there long term. The patients weren't standard post-op recoveries. They were operators, all special forces, MARSOC, reconnaissance units, a rotating population of men and women who had been through things that didn't appear in their official service records. They came in with complex wounds, suppressed psychological fractures, and a professional distrust of anyone who asked too many questions. The staff learned quickly that the best way to earn respect in those hallways wasn't competence, it was consistency, showing up, not flinching, doing the job without needing acknowledgement for it. Marin Solis had been doing exactly that for 3 years. She was 32, and on paper she was an unremarkable addition to the hospital's civilian nursing staff. Her personnel file listed her previous employer as a Level 2 trauma center in Reno, Nevada, where she'd worked for 2 years following a brief gap in her employment history that was attributed without elaboration to a transition period. Her references were solid. Her licensing was clean. She'd passed every background and security clearance requirement without a single flag. She was quiet in a way that didn't invite questions, not cold. Patients consistently rated her highly in the feedback surveys, and 2 of the hospital's attending physicians had specifically requested her on their rotation schedules. But she didn't socialize in the break room. She didn't volunteer personal history. She wore her dark hair pinned back tight, kept her expression professionally neutral in most situations, and had a way of moving through a crowded hallway that made her somehow difficult to track with your eyes, like she'd learned how to take up less space than she actually occupied. Most of the staff assumed she was just introverted, private, the kind of person who'd had a rough stretch somewhere in her past and preferred to let the work speak for itself. The SEALs on the recovery ward didn't think much about her one way or another. She was competent. She was calm. She didn't treat them like exhibits or martyrs, which put her ahead of roughly 40% of the civilian medical staff they encountered. Chief Petty Officer Darnell Oakes, who was 17 days into recovery from a femoral repair and chronically bored, had once described her to his teammate as the nurse who gives off the vibe that she's seen worse than whatever you're about to complain about. He meant it as a compliment. He wasn't wrong, but the morning that changed everything started like most mornings at Harbor Reach, with fog, understaffing, and someone's monitoring equipment alarming at a frequency that suggested either a genuine crisis or a loose electrode. Marin arrived at 6:45, 12 minutes before the start of her shift, changed into fresh scrubs in the staff locker room, and pulled up the overnight report on the hallway tablet before she'd even made it to the nursing station. 2 patients had been flagged for deterioration in the night. Room 114, a MARSOC gunnery sergeant named Fowler, who was 3 weeks post-abdominal repair and developing signs of a slow internal bleed, needed updated vitals and a physician review before the morning round. Room 119 had a newer admission, a composite injury case that had come in through military air transport the previous evening, still being processed through intake. She handled Fowler first. He was awake, which he made clear by complaining about the quality of the scrambled eggs he hadn't yet received. Marin checked his drain output, palpated his abdomen with enough precision that Fowler stopped complaining mid-sentence and went still, and made a notation in his chart that resulted in a call to the attending physician before 7:15. "You're not going to tell me what you found," Fowler said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to tell Dr. Abrams what I found," Marin said. "Then Dr. Abrams is going to tell you. You nurses always do that." "We do," she agreed, without apology. She was 3 steps into the hallway when the front entrance doors at the far end of the corridor opened and the sound of the facility changed. It was subtle, a shift in air pressure, or maybe just the quality of the noise, but Marin had been in enough high-tension environments to know the difference between a normal arrival and one that carried weight behind it. She turned without thinking. 4 men came through the door first. Navy utilities, no rank visible from this distance, but their movement told the story. Controlled, spread slightly, scanning. Not aggressive, but not casual either. Behind them came a hospital liaison officer and a 5th figure who walked differently from the rest. Commander Derek Voss was 41 years old and built like someone had designed him for a specific purpose and never updated the specifications. He was carrying a tactical lead in his right hand, and at the end of that lead was a Belgian Malinois, who moved with the fluid, contained energy of an animal that had been trained past the point where instinct and discipline were separate things. Marin saw the dog before she processed anything else. She stopped walking. The Malinois, dark-coated, scarred along the left flank in a way that wasn't recent, lifted his nose from the floor in a single sharp motion. His head swung toward her, his body went rigid. Marin recognized what she was looking at approximately 1 second before the dog recognized her. She turned and walked the other direction. Not fast enough to draw attention, just deliberate, just purposeful, just a nurse heading somewhere she needed to be. She made it to the supply corridor before she heard, behind her, the sound of a military working dog beginning to pull hard against its lead. The Malinois' name, Marin already knew, was Shadow. She had known it for 5 years. She had also known, for 5 years, that Shadow was alive and still in service. She'd followed his unit's public records from a distance, the way you follow something you're not supposed to be watching, carefully, from the edge of your peripheral vision. What she hadn't known was that Commander Derek Voss would be assigned to Harbor Reach. She found out later, from a staffing memo she hadn't seen because it had been distributed the day she was off shift, that Voss and his team were here to oversee the transfer of care for 2 operators from their unit who were in long-term recovery. That the K9 had been brought in because Voss refused to place Shadow in a standard kennel facility for the duration of the assignment, citing the animal's documented behavioral instability when separated from his handler for extended periods. Which was true. She knew that too. She spent the first 4 hours of her shift doing an excellent impression of someone who wasn't thinking about any of this. She changed Fowler's drain. She administered medications on schedule. She assisted with a dressing change on a hand injury in room 122 that required more precision than it should have because the patient, a stubborn, taciturn woman from a signals intelligence unit, kept moving at the wrong moment. She updated charts. She attended a 9 o'clock care team huddle and contributed 2 relevant clinical observations. She did not go near the East Corridor, where Voss and his team had been assigned a staging area near the unit they were liaising with. She did not think about what would happen if Shadow found her first. At 11:14, Shadow found her first. She was coming out of the medication room with a tray when she heard the sound of nails on tile and looked up to find 94 pounds of Belgian Malinois coming around the corner at a controlled trot, lead trailing behind him, which meant his handler was somewhere out of sight, and there had been a failure of containment that the handler probably already knew about and was currently sprinting to correct. Shadow stopped when he saw her. Marin set the medication tray down on a supply cart to her left. She did this slowly, without looking away from the dog. Shadow stood 12 feet away. His body was vibrating. Not aggression, not exactly, but the specific tension of an animal in the middle of a cognitive conflict between training and something older. His ears were forward. His tail was low and still. He was staring at her with the focused, slightly tilted attention of an animal trying to solve a problem. She knew what he was doing. He was trying to reconcile what his nose was telling him with what 5 years of changed context said was impossible. She heard boots in the corridor behind him, multiple sets, moving fast. "Shadow!" The voice was sharp and controlled. "Shadow, heel." The dog didn't move. Voss came around the corner at a near run and stopped when he took in the scene. His dog, unresponsive to a direct command, standing in an empty corridor, locked onto a civilian nurse who was standing very still with her hands at her sides. 2 of his seals appeared behind him, then a third. Voss's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, step back from—" "Don't," Marin said. It wasn't aggressive. It was the voice of someone who understood the situation more clearly than the person giving instructions. "If I move quickly right now, his conflict resolves in a direction none of us want. Let me handle this." Voss stared at her. She could see him making the assessment. Threat level, physical profile. The fact that his dog was responding to her in a way that didn't match any scenario his training had prepared him for. "He won't hurt you," Voss said, but there was a question embedded in the statement. "I know he won't," Marin said. And then, quietly, before anyone could process what was happening, she crouched down, opened her hands palm up, and said it. "Shadow, stand down. Home." The dog's growl, which no one had heard start, stopped. His body shook once. His tail moved just slightly, from low and still to something approaching tentative. He walked forward, slowly, like he was afraid of what he might find, and pressed his face against her chest. Marin put one hand against the side of his head and held it there. The corridor was silent, except for the sound of the hospital going about its business somewhere further away. Voss had gone very still. "Where did you learn that phrase?" he said. His voice had changed. The command register was gone. What replaced it was something that sounded like a man standing at the edge of a drop he hadn't seen coming. Marin looked up at him. "The same place Shadow did," she said. They put her in one of the small family consultation rooms off the main corridor, which was a polite way of saying they needed her contained while the SEALs had a conversation she wasn't part of. She didn't object. She sat in the chair closest to the door, old habit, and waited. Shadow had been returned to his crate, which had required Voss physically guiding the dog away from Marin by the collar while the animal kept looking back over his shoulder. Marin had watched this without expression. The nursing charge on her floor, a no-nonsense woman named Petra Dumont, who'd been at Harbor Reach for 9 years, had appeared at the consultation room door approximately 6 minutes after Marin was escorted inside. "You want to tell me what that was?" Petra asked. "Not particularly," Marin said. Petra looked at her for a long moment. "The commander is asking about your file." "He won't find what he's looking for," Marin said. "Some of it's sealed." Petra absorbed this. She had been around long enough to know what that meant and what it didn't mean. "Are you in trouble?" Marin thought about the question honestly. Depends on what he thinks he knows. She found out what Voss thought he knew approximately 40 minutes later, when he came into the consultation room and closed the door behind him without being invited to do so. He sat across from her. He didn't have Shadow with him. He had a folder, which he put on the table but didn't open. His team was presumably outside the door. He was composed in the way that experienced officers learned to be composed, not because they weren't feeling anything, but because they'd trained the expression of feeling to remain behind a very specific wall. "Marcus Voss," he said. Not a question, not her name, a name. Marin waited. "How was my teammate?" Voss said. 8 years. He died during a classified exfil operation in the Halvar Mountain Corridor. The mission report listed one attending combat medic who was confirmed present in the final extraction window. That medic's service record was subsequently sealed under a classification order I've been trying to pull for 4 years. Marin didn't say anything. "Shadow was Marcus's dog," Voss said. "I took him after Marcus died because Marcus didn't have family who could handle him. Shadow hasn't responded to anyone the way he just responded to you. Not in 5 years. He paused. That phrase, "stand down, home," Marcus used it as a de-escalation reset during combat recovery. He told me he'd only ever taught it to 2 living creatures. One of them was Shadow. He opened the folder. Inside was a photograph, grainy, taken in low light, the kind of image that had been pulled from surveillance or helmet cam footage and enhanced until it was just barely useful. It showed a figure in a combat medic's gear crouched over a wounded man, one hand on his chest, the other working. The figure's face was partially obscured, but the posture, the build, the angle of the head. Marin didn't look at the photograph. She was looking at Voss. The second living creature Marcus taught that phrase to, Voss said quietly, was the combat medic who was with him when he died. He looked up from the folder. And I've been told for 5 years that she didn't make it out. The room held that statement for a moment. People get told a lot of things, Marin said. Voss's hands were flat on the table. I need you to tell me what happened on that mountain. That's classified. I have clearance. You have clearance for part of it, Marin said. You don't have clearance for the part that matters. Something moved through Voss's expression. Grief, maybe, or the specific kind of anger that lives right next to grief for so long, the two become indistinguishable. Marcus was my teammate. Whatever you know about how he died, I know everything about how he died, Marin said, and her voice stayed level, but just barely. I was there for all of it. Every minute, I held his hand through the last 4 of them. She paused. And then I spent 5 years letting people believe I didn't, because the alternative required disclosing information that would have compromised assets still in active operation. Voss stared at her. There are people alive right now, she said, because the fiction that I died on that mountain stayed intact long enough for 3 ongoing operations to conclude without interference. She didn't look away from him. I don't expect that to make you feel better. I'm telling you so you understand why the file looks the way it looks. The silence in the room was a different quality now, denser. How long have you been here? Voss said. 3 years. Under this name? It's my name. It was always my name, Marin Solis. She let him sit with that. The identity was a layer of operational cover on top of an existing identity. When the operation concluded, I came back to myself. The civilian record shows a gap, and the military record is sealed, and that's exactly how it was designed to work. Voss rubbed a hand over his face. She could see the machinery of it catching up with him. Not just what she was saying, but the implications behind it. The fact that someone had known. The fact that this information had been kept from him specifically. The fact that Shadow had just recognized a woman who was supposed to be dead. He talked about you, Sham. About you, Voss said finally. Marcus talked about you. Not by name. He was careful about that, even with teammates. But there was a medic. He said she was the only person who'd ever outpaced him on a technical climb. Said she had better hands than the unit surgeon. A beat. Said she was one of the most dangerous people he'd ever worked with, and nobody who met her believed it for the first 20 minutes. Marin looked at the table. He was right, she said. About the 20 minutes part. What Voss didn't know. What the personnel file didn't contain. What the sealed records only partially documented. What even Marin had spent 5 years trying to process, in the way that people process things they have no framework for, was that the Halvar operation had not gone wrong in the way the official incident report described. It had gone wrong in a different way, a more complicated way. A way that implicated people who were still active and still decorated and still giving orders at the level of the organization that had sealed the records in the first place. She hadn't told Voss this. Not yet. She wasn't sure she was going to. She was still sitting in the consultation room. She'd been told to wait, and she was waiting, which was the thing she did when she needed to think without anyone watching her think. When the door opened again, and it wasn't Voss. It was one of his SEALs. Younger, maybe 28. He had the look of someone who'd been sent on an errand he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Commander's asking for you back in the staging area, the SEAL said. Is he? Yes, ma'am. The ma'am came out slightly uncertain, which she recognized. The specific discomfort of a trained operator addressing someone whose exact status he couldn't categorize. She stood, smoothed her scrubs, picked up the badge she'd set on the table when she sat down and clipped it back to her chest. The photograph in the folder on the table, the grainy image from the mountain, she left where it was. The SEAL held the door for her. She walked out into the corridor, back into the hospital's ordinary noise, and felt the thing she always felt in moments like this. The particular friction of 2 different versions of herself occupying the same space, the civilian nurse and the other one, the one that had learned a set of skills in a sequence of places that didn't appear in her resume. She had spent 3 years at Harbor Reach, becoming someone who was good at one kind of job. She had spent a decade before that becoming someone who was good at a very different kind. Shadow was in a crate in the staging area, and when she walked through the door, he stood up and pressed his nose against the crate door and looked at her with an expression that had no clinical description. She stopped in front of the crate and crouched down. Put 2 fingers against the mesh. Shadow pressed his nose against them. Voss was watching from across the room, and he had 2 more of his team with him now, and all 3 of them were watching her with the same expression. The expression of men who had been trained to trust their own assessment of a situation and were currently facing an assessment that didn't fit any category they'd been trained to recognize. "There's something you need to know about the Halvar operation," Maren said. She wasn't looking at Voss. She was still looking at Shadow. "The mission report that was filed," she said, "is not a complete account of what happened. The classified sections cover the exfil sequence and the casualty outcomes. But they don't cover what happened in the 40 minutes before the exfil window opened." She felt the stillness of the room sharpen. "In those 40 minutes," she said, "Marcus was still alive. And the call that determined the shape of the extraction, who was recovered, and in what sequence, was not made by the field team." She looked up at Voss. "It was made by someone who wasn't on the mountain." Voss's face had gone very controlled, the kind of control that is the opposite of calm. "Who?" he said. "That's the question I've been carrying for 5 years, Maren said. "And the reason I'm still carrying it is that the person who made that call still has enough institutional protection to make answering it officially very difficult." The room was quiet enough that she could hear Shadow breathing through the crate door. "But something changed recently," she said. "One of the assets that made the cover story necessary completed his final assignment 8 months ago, which means the operational justification for the sealed record has expired." She stood up. "Which means someone with the right clearance," she said, "could now request a declassification review." She looked at Voss steadily. "You have that clearance," she said. She watched the information land, watched him process it, not just what it meant, but what it asked of him, what it would cost to pursue it. The kind of accounting that men like Voss did quickly and thoroughly, and usually without showing any of the work on their face. "If I request that review," Voss said slowly, "and what you're describing is accurate about who made the call." "It will be difficult," Maren said, "and it will take longer than it should, and there will be people who try to stop it." She paused. "And it will be the only way Marcus's service record accurately reflects what he actually did on that mountain." Something shifted in Voss's expression. Fractional. The kind of thing you only caught if you were watching for it. "He deserves that," Voss said quietly. "He does," Maren agreed. She was still holding Shadow's gaze through the crate mesh. The dog hadn't looked away from her since she'd entered the room. There was more to tell. She knew that. There were pieces of the Halvar operation that Voss didn't know existed, that the sealed records only partially described, that implicated specific individuals in decisions that had resulted in Marcus's death in a way that was not accurately characterized as a combat casualty. She would tell him. She'd made that decision, she realized, somewhere in the 40 minutes she'd been sitting in the consultation room without fully acknowledging to herself that she was making it. But there was one piece she needed to verify first, one detail that she'd been unable to confirm through the channels available to her as a civilian nurse in a military recovery hospital, that she'd been waiting, maybe without knowing she was waiting, for someone with Voss's access to walk through a door so she could ask. She turned to face him fully. "The officer who made the call on the mountain," she said, "the one who wasn't there. What's his current assignment?" Voss looked at her for a long moment. "Deputy Director of Special Operations Command," he said. "He took the position 14 months ago." The room didn't change. The light didn't change. Maren's expression didn't change. But Shadow made a sound, low, almost inaudible, and pressed his nose hard against the crate door, and she understood that he was reacting to something in her, something physiological and involuntary that even 3 years of deliberately quiet living hadn't completely trained out of her. Because what Voss had just told her meant that the person who had left Marcus on that mountain was now in a position to approve or deny the very declassification review that would expose what he'd done. She looked at Voss. "Then we're going to need to be very careful," she said, "about how we do this." Voss didn't answer immediately. That was the thing about men who'd spent careers making decisions under pressure. They'd learned that the first response that came to mind was almost never the right one, and they'd learned to sit in the discomfort of not yet answering long enough to find the one that was. He looked at Marin. He looked at Shadow. He looked at the two SEALs standing to his left, both of whom were doing their best impression of furniture and not entirely pulling it off. "Outside," he said to them. They went without argument, which told Marin something about how Voss ran his team. The door closed. The room contracted to the three of them, Voss, Marin, and the dog pressing his nose against the crate mesh with a focus that hadn't wavered in 10 minutes. "You're saying Deputy Director Harlan Wick made the call," Voss said. "I'm saying the call came from his level," Marin said carefully. "I'm saying the field team never received a direct order from the extraction coordinator. I'm saying there was a communication window, 11 minutes, where the helicopter could have held position for a second attempt, and someone with override authority closed that window from a command post 60 miles away." "That's not the same as naming him." "No," she agreed, "which is why I need the declassification review, because what I have is memory and 3 partial signal intercepts. I've been sitting on for 5 years that I cannot officially submit anywhere without exposing my own survival, which until 8 months ago would have compromised people who didn't deserve to be compromised." She paused. "Now the operational window is closed, and those people are safe, and I am still sitting on evidence of a decision that killed Marcus Vallon, and I am done sitting on it." Voss absorbed the name Marcus Vallon, not Marcus Voss, the name she'd given her colleague's full name, without visible reaction, which meant he'd already known it or had suspected the story was bigger than the name he'd offered initially. "How did you get the intercepts?" he said. "I was attached to a signals unit for the last 18 months of my active service," Marin said. "The intercepts came through my board during the post-operation debrief window. I retained copies because something about the communication gap didn't align with the official explanation, and because I'd watched Marcus die and I wanted to understand why." She met his eyes. "I've had them in a secured location for 5 years. I've looked at them approximately once a month, and I've not done anything with them because the cost of doing something was higher than I could justify while the operations were still running." "And now?" "Now the cost is different," she said. Voss turned away from her, and she watched him think. It wasn't pacing. He was too controlled for that. But something in his stance changed, the slight forward weight of a man who was reorganizing the contents of a room he thought he'd already mapped. "Wick is not a man who responds well to institutional review," Voss said finally. "He has relationships at JAG, at the Inspector General's office, at 3 separate oversight committees. Whatever you're describing, if it's what you're describing, he will know the moment a declassification request is filed." "I know," Marin said, "and he has the authority to have it redirected to a classified proceeding where he controls the information flow." "I know that too." "Then you understand what filing this request would actually accomplish," Voss said, and there was something in his voice now that wasn't quite frustration, more like the exhaustion of someone who'd been in this specific corner before and had the scar tissue to prove it. "It would accomplish starting the clock," Marin said. "The moment the request exists on record, the information exists on record. Whatever happens after that, however it gets redirected, reclassified, buried, there's a filing date, there's a stated basis, there's a name attached to an inquiry." She looked at him steadily. "Wick can suppress it. He cannot make it not have happened." The room was quiet for long enough that Shadow sat down inside his crate, though he kept his eyes on Marin. "You've been planning this," Voss said. "I've been preparing for it," she said. "There's a difference. Planning implies I knew how it was going to unfold. I didn't know. I still don't." She looked at her hands for a moment, an involuntary gesture, and she recognized it as such. The kind of thing that slipped through when you'd been holding a particular tension for a very long time, and your body found small ways to express it. "I knew that at some point the operational justification would expire, and the question would become what I was going to do with what I'd been carrying. I've been sitting with that question for 8 months. What changed today?" She looked up. "Shadow walked around a corner and recognized me," she said, "and you were at the end of his lead." The conversation ended without resolution, which was the only honest way it could have ended at that point. Voss needed time, he said so plainly, which she respected. A man who acknowledged needing time rather than pretending to decide faster than he actually could. He would speak with his team. He would consult a JAG officer he trusted. He would review what he had access to in Marcus's operational file and determine the dimensions of what wasn't there. Marin went back to work. This was less straightforward than it sounds. She had missed most of her morning rounds during the consultation room sequence, and Petra Dumont, who was not paid enough to compensate for the administrative irregularities that followed unusual events, had redistributed Marin's patient load to two other nurses and was now running approximately 40 minutes behind on her own documentation. Marin's reappearance was received with a look that communicated several things simultaneously without requiring words. "Fowler got his imaging," Petra said. "The attending wants to talk to you about the notation you made this morning." "Is he bleeding?" "Slow. They're monitoring." "Then my notation was accurate." Petra's expression was the expression of someone who had decided, as a professional matter, not to ask the obvious question. "The two patients in the staging unit, the ones Commander Voss's team is overseeing, they're going to need regular nursing contact. The commander requested you specifically." "Of course he did," Marin said, without inflection. "Do you have a problem with that?" Marin thought about it genuinely. "Not yet," she said. She spent the next 3 hours doing what she did every day, moving between rooms, checking vitals, adjusting lines, listening to the particular silences of patients who had things they weren't saying, and occasionally pulling those things out through a combination of patience and the specific quality of attention that she'd learned was the most useful thing she had to offer in most situations. The men and women on the recovery ward were not easy patients. They were wary, trained to minimize complaint, and often operating on a pain tolerance that made standard assessment tools functionally useless. She was good at this. She hadn't expected to be when she first came to Harbor Reach. She'd been good at the technical aspects of trauma nursing before that, in the Reno hospital. But the particular skill of managing operators in recovery was something she'd developed here, over 3 years, and she knew it was partly because she understood things about their experience that she could not explain without explaining everything else. She didn't think about Voss for most of those 3 hours. She thought about Fowler's drain output and whether the attending's monitoring plan was aggressive enough. She thought about the signals intelligence officer in 122, who was having trouble with her hand mobility in a way that suggested the nerve involvement was more extensive than the initial surgical notes indicated. She thought about the logistics of 2 additional patients being added to her load at the end of a shift that had already been disrupted. She thought about Marcus approximately once, for approximately 4 seconds, while she was standing at the medication cart and waiting for a printer to produce a label that was taking longer than it should. She had learned to keep it to 4 seconds. It was a discipline she'd developed gradually, over years, the way you developed any skill that was fundamentally about managing something that didn't want to be managed. 4 seconds was enough to acknowledge it. It wasn't enough to let it expand into something she couldn't contain inside a working day. The printer produced the label. She moved on. The first sign that the day was going to become something other than complicated but manageable came at 2:17 in the afternoon when one of Voss's SEALs, the younger one who'd come to the consultation room door, appeared at the nursing station with an expression that people wore when they'd been sent to deliver information they didn't entirely understand. His name was Petty Officer Garrett Wynn, and she'd gathered from the way he moved through the hospital that he was probably the newest member of the team. He had a quality of watchfulness that hadn't yet become the specific kind of watchfulness that came from experience. It was still broader, still trying to catch everything at once, rather than knowing what to look for. "There's a situation," he said when he reached her. "What kind?" "Medical." He hesitated. "Possibly. The commander asked me to get you." She put down the chart she was holding. "Which patient?" "Not one of ours." He stopped, reconsidered. "Not one of the recovery patients. There's a man who came in through the main entrance about 20 minutes ago. Didn't go through admissions. He's in the east corridor near the staging area. He's..." Another pause. "He's not in good shape." "That's a description that applies to most of the people in this building," Marin said. "Can you be more specific?" "He's in uniform," Wynn said, "and the commander knows him. And the commander's asking for you specifically, which, I can tell you, that's not something that happens a lot." She followed Wynn through the east corridor at a pace that split the difference between urgent and conspicuous. The east wing was less trafficked than the main recovery floor. Administrative offices, storage, the staging area that had been assigned to Voss's team. And at this hour, it was quiet enough that she heard the voices before she turned the last corner. Two voices. One was Voss. The other was rougher, more labored, the voice of someone who was managing pain while trying to sound like they weren't. She came around the corner and saw them. Voss was crouched beside a man who was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, and the man was in Navy utilities with a Master Chief's insignia on his collar, and he was gray in a way that people got when significant amounts of blood had been lost over a period of time that was longer than the acute emergency it was presenting as. There was a jacket pressed against his left side, Voss's jacket, she realized from the cut of it, and the pressure Voss was applying was steady, but the saturation through the fabric was already visible from 10 feet away. Behind Voss stood two more of his SEALs, and they had the stance of men who had been told to stay back and were not entirely comfortable with that instruction. Marin was already assessing before she reached them. Age, maybe 50, maybe 55. Skin tone indicating blood loss over time, not acute trauma. This was not a fresh injury. He'd been managing something for hours, possibly longer. "What happened?" she said. "Found him in the parking lot," Voss said. "He came on foot, won't let us call this in." She crouched beside the Master Chief. He looked at her with eyes that were working hard to stay focused. "I'm not going through admissions," he said. His voice was controlled in the way that suggested it was taking effort to keep it controlled. "Okay," she said. "You don't have to." She looked at Voss. "I need to get him off this floor. There's a treatment room off the supply corridor. Unlocked, not on the main system. Can your people move him without drawing attention? Yes. Then let's go." His name, she learned while she was cutting away the improvised pressure dressing and getting her first look at the wound, was Felix Drum. He'd been a Master Chief for 11 years, which meant he knew exactly how bad the situation was and had chosen to manage the information about its badness with a precision that was both impressive and, from a clinical standpoint, genuinely dangerous. The wound was a through and through on the left lateral flank, entry and exit. Both visible, reasonably clean lines suggesting a small caliber round rather than fragmentation. The tract of the injury passing below the lowest rib at an angle that had largely avoided the major vessels, but had done something to the muscle layer that had been bleeding slowly and persistently for... She pressed carefully around the wound margins and felt his sharp intake of breath. She'd say 8 to 12 hours minimum. "When did this happen?" she said. "Last night." "Where?" "Off base." "You need imaging," she said. "I can manage the hemorrhage. I can clean and pack this. I can give you enough stabilization to function for the next several hours. But I can't tell you what's happening inside without imaging. And if there's a bleeder I can't visualize, you could..." "I know," he said. "Then why are you here instead of an ER?" He looked past her at Voss. Something passed between them. The kind of communication that happened between people who had a long shared history and had established shorthand. "Drum," Voss said. "Not yet," the Master Chief said. Marin recognized this pattern. She'd encountered it before. People who had information they were managing on a specific timeline. People for whom the revelation of that information had to happen in a particular order for particular reasons. She didn't have enough context to understand what the order was or why it mattered. What she had was a man losing blood in a supply corridor treatment room and a working knowledge of how to stop it. She stopped it. It took 40 minutes, 3 sets of gloves, a suture kit from the treatment room's emergency stock, and the kind of focused silence that she defaulted to when the work required all of her attention. Voss stood to one side and watched without speaking, which she appreciated. Wynne stood at the door. The other 2 SEALs had positioned themselves in the corridor outside, which she noted and filed away. When she was done, wound packed, sutured at the skin level, pressure dressing applied. Drum looked better in the immediate sense and still looked wrong in the sustained sense. His color was improving with the fluid she'd started through a forearm IV, but he was going to need monitoring, and he was going to need imaging, and neither of those things was available in a supply corridor. "You need to tell me what's happening," she said. "Not the whole story, just enough so I understand what I'm managing." Drum looked at Voss again. "He doesn't know," Voss said. "She does." Drum looked at Marin. He had pale eyes, the light gray of worn concrete, and they were assessing her with the directness of a man who had spent a career learning to evaluate people quickly and accurately. "You're Marin Solis," he said. "Yes." "You were the medic on the Halvar corridor operation." She didn't confirm or deny. She waited. I was the extraction coordinator on that operation, Felix Drum said. The treatment room was very quiet. I was the one who made the call on the helicopter, he said, and for 5 years I've been told it was the right call. That the intelligence said the LZ was compromised and a second approach would have cost the whole team instead of one man. He paused. His breathing was controlled, but she could hear the effort beneath it. 2 days ago, someone showed me the communication log from that night, the real one, not the version that went into the official record. Marin's hands were still. The LZ wasn't compromised, Drum said. The intelligence report that told me it was fabricated. The signal intercepts had been altered. Someone needed that window to close, and they gave me information that made closing it look like the only defensible choice. He looked at her steadily. I made the call that left your man on that mountain, he said, and I made it based on intelligence that was designed to make me make it. Marin sat with that for 3 seconds. Exactly 3. Who showed you the communication log? She said. Someone who's been building a case, Drum said. Someone inside the organization who's been watching Wick for a long time and finally had enough to move. They came to me because my name is on the extraction record, because I'm the one who signed the order. He glanced down at his left side. And someone found out I'd been contacted, which is presumably why I have a hole in me. Voss was very still across the room. How long have you had the log? Marin said. 48 hours. Where is it? Joe Drum reached inside his utility shirt, carefully, with his right hand, avoiding the bandaged left side, and produced a small sealed case, the kind used for electronic media storage in field environments. He held it out to her. She looked at it without taking it. Why me? She said. Because you have the intercepts, Drum said. The person who contacted me knew you had them. They said the communication log and your intercepts together constitute a complete record. Either piece alone is challengeable. Together they're corroborating, Marin said. Mutually corroborating, he said, from 2 independent sources at 2 different points in the communication chain. That's not something you can reclassify your way out of. She took the case. It was lighter than she expected. She didn't know why that registered, but it did. The specific lightness of something that had been waiting a very long time to exist in the open. You should know, Drum said, and his voice had shifted into something that didn't have a rank structure behind it, that I signed that order. Whatever else happened, whoever manipulated the intelligence, whatever decisions were made 60 miles away, my name is on the record. A full accounting is going to include that. He met her eyes. I'm not asking you to leave it out. I'm asking you to include the context. Marin looked at the storage case in her hand. I'm a nurse, she said. I don't make decisions about what goes into official records. No, Drum said. But you make decisions about what information you give the people who do. She stood up. Her knees were slightly stiff from crouching on the treatment room floor, which was not a cinematic detail, but was the kind of thing that happened when you spent 40 minutes focused on something and your body went quietly about its business of accumulating time. I'm going to check on you in 2 hours, she said. If your pressure isn't holding, we're going into admissions regardless of what you want. You're not going to bleed out in a supply corridor. Understood, Drum said. She looked at Voss. He was looking at the storage case in her hand with an expression that had multiple components, recognition, and something underneath recognition that was older and less composed. You're going to need a JAG officer, she said to him, not the one you were planning to consult. Someone outside the normal chain for your unit. I have someone in mind, Voss said. Call them tonight, she said, because if Drum's been marked, whoever did it knows he came here. And Harbor Reach is a small facility with a known staff roster. She paused at the door. We have a limited window before someone starts asking why a wounded Master Chief didn't go through official channels. She stepped into the corridor, and the weight of the storage case in her left hand was precise and physical, and entirely unlike anything she'd held in 3 years of civilian life. Shadow was in his crate in the staging area at the far end of the corridor. She couldn't see him from here, but she knew he was there in the particular way you knew about things that had been part of you long enough to leave an impression that outlasted their physical presence. She walked back toward the main nursing station with a measured pace, and she thought about Wick, who was 60 miles away at the time of the Halvar operation, and was now Deputy Director of Special Operations Command, who had sent fabricated intelligence to an extraction coordinator in a window where a man named Marcus Vallon was still alive on a mountain. She thought about the communication log in the sealed case. She thought about her 3 intercepts, which had lived in a secured location for 5 years and had never been combined with any other piece of evidence because there was no other piece of evidence to combine them with, until now. She thought about the fact that Drum had been shot within 48 hours of being contacted, and she thought, not for the first time but with more specificity than before, about how the same person who had fabricated intelligence to close a helicopter window in the Halvar corridor would approach the problem of 2 independent evidence sources suddenly existing in the same location, in the possession of people who had reason to use them. She turned into the main corridor and nearly walked into a man coming the other direction. He was in civilian clothes. She'd never seen him before. He had a visitor's badge clipped to his jacket, and he was moving with the specific, deliberate quality of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had decided the best way to get there was to look like they weren't in a hurry. He glanced at her. His eyes dropped briefly to her left hand. She had, without being aware of doing it, already turned the storage case so that the hand holding it was facing away from him. He looked at her face. She looked at his. She kept walking. She did not look back. But she moved to the nursing station by the fastest route that wasn't a run, and when she got there, she opened the lower drawer where she kept her personal items during shifts, and she put the storage case under her lunch bag and her spare set of gloves, and she straightened up and looked at the hallway behind her. The man with the visitor's badge was standing at the far end of the main corridor. He was looking at her. She turned back to her monitor and pulled up a patient chart she didn't need to read, because the man at the end of the corridor was still there in her peripheral vision, and the worst thing she could do was look at him again. He was clocking her reaction. That was the point of standing where he was standing. You didn't position yourself at the end of a corridor with a clear sight line to someone unless you were measuring their response to being seen. It was an assessment tool, and she knew it, and the only useful response was to give him nothing to measure. She spent 45 seconds updating a notation she'd already made in Fowler's chart. Then she picked up the desk phone and called the staging area. Wynne answered on the second ring. "The man with the visitor's badge in the main corridor," she said. "Don't look now. In about 60 seconds, walk to the water fountain near the east entrance and take note of his face without making eye contact." A pause. "Understood." "Then find the commander." She hung up and went to check on the signals intelligence officer in 122, which was a legitimate clinical task, and also took her in the opposite direction from the main corridor. The officer. Her name was Reyes. Specialist 3rd Class Dara Reyes. 26, left-hand nerve damage from a compound fracture sustained during a vehicle incident that the intake form described with the specific vagueness of events that had happened in places that weren't on approved travel itineraries, was sitting up in bed doing hand extension exercises with the focus of someone who had decided that rehabilitation was a problem to be solved rather than a process to be endured. "How's the range?" Marin asked. "Better than yesterday," Reyes said. "Still not great." Marin ran her through the standard assessment: grip strength, sensation distribution, the specific test for intrinsic muscle function that tended to reveal nerve involvement the gross motor tests missed. Reyes's results were modestly improved from that morning. Not as improved as she wanted them to be, but the nerve pathway was intact and the signal was moving, which was the most important piece. "You're ahead of where you should be at this point post-op," Marin said. "Is that actually true, or are you just saying that?" "Both," Marin said. "It's true, and I'm saying it. They're not mutually exclusive." Reyes looked at her with the expression of someone who had spent enough time around people who managed information for institutional purposes to have developed a functional allergy to soft pedaling. The attending said 4 to 6 months for full function. What do you think? "I think 4 to 6 months is the range, and where you land in that range is going to depend on how seriously you take the home exercise protocol, which most people don't." She looked at Reyes directly. "You'll take it seriously. How do you know?" "Because you're doing your exercises at 3 in the afternoon when no one's watching." Reyes almost smiled. Not quite. "The nurses here are different from the last place." "Where was the last place?" "Landstuhl." A pause. "Germany." "I know where Landstuhl is," Marin said. Reyes looked at her for a moment with the specific reassessment that people performed when a piece of information didn't fit their existing category. Marin noted it and moved on. She was back in the corridor outside 122 when Voss appeared at the far end of it. Not the main corridor, the interior one, the quieter route through the east wing. He moved with the contained urgency of someone who had something to say and had made a decision about how to say it. "The man with the badge," he said when he reached her. "His name is Kurt Selby. He's a civilian contractor attached to SOCOM Oversight. He's also, based on everything I know about how Wick runs his operation, almost certainly not here because he has a family member in recovery." "No," Marin agreed. "He's been here before. Wynn checked with the front desk. He signed in 3 days ago. Same contractor credential. Before we arrived." She absorbed that. He was already scoping the facility. Before anyone knew Drum was going to show up here. Before anyone knew I'd been assigned here. Voss paused. Which means either someone had prior intelligence about what Drum was planning, or Selby has a broader surveillance mandate than just the two of us. Marin thought about what Drum had said. 2 days ago, someone showed me the communication log. If Wick's people had been monitoring whoever had originally contacted Drum, they might have had a 2-day head start on the trajectory of where this was going. Harbor Reach wasn't an obvious destination, but it wasn't an impossible one. Her sealed file had her listed here, and anyone with Wick's clearance level could pull a sealed personnel record. "He knows I'm here," she said. "Not because of Drum, because of me." Voss looked at her. "Wick's been waiting for the operational window to close," she said. "Waiting for the classification justification to expire, because he knew that when it expired, the risk calculus changed for anyone who'd been sitting on evidence. He's been watching for movement." She paused. "I've been here for 3 years and I haven't moved. But the moment a K9 recognizes me in a public corridor, it generated a report," Voss said quietly. "The incident this morning. Any unusual event in a facility with this security classification generates an automatic flag." She'd known that. She'd known it this morning, and she'd let Shadow do what Shadow was going to do anyway, because stopping it would have required a reaction that would have looked worse on a flag report than the incident itself. But knowing it and hearing it said aloud in the context of Kurt Selby's visitor log were two different things. "Where is Selby now?" she said. "Wynn tracked him to the administrative wing. He's speaking with someone in the records office." Her patient files, her employment documentation, her 3-year paper trail as a civilian nurse, which was clean and complete and entirely legitimate, and which would not by itself tell anyone anything they didn't already have access to from the sealed file. But the act of pulling it, of cross-referencing it, of building the kind of dossier that preceded an official inquiry, was its own kind of move. It established a record of investigation. It created a paper trail that ran in the other direction. "How long before he can do anything official with what he's gathering?" she said. "Depends on what he's authorized to initiate. If he's here as a preliminary fact finder, couple of days, maybe less." Voss met her eyes. "Marin, the storage case." "I have it." "If Selby is authorized to conduct a facility search, he's not there yet," she said. "He's still in the dossier building phase. You don't get a facility search authorization in an active military medical center without a specific evidentiary basis, and right now he has a flag report about a K9 recognition incident and whatever he can pull from the records office." She paused. "We have time. Not a lot of it." "Then what do we do with the time we have?" She thought about what she'd said to Voss the night before. Starting the clock. The value of a filing date, a stated basis, a name attached to an inquiry. All of that remained true. It was also true that the sequence mattered, that filing a declassification request while Selby was actively building a countercase in the administrative wing was a different proposition than filing it from a position of complete preparation. "The JAG officer you mentioned," she said. "How quickly can you reach them?" "Tonight," I said. "I meant it." "Can you get them here?" "Here as in Oregon?" "Here as in Harbor Reach within 24 hours. He studied her. "That's a different ask." "I know. It's going to require me to tell them enough that they'll make the trip, which means I'm starting conversations I can't unstart." "Yes," she said. "That's what I'm asking." Voss was quiet for a moment. She watched him do the accounting. It wasn't a simple calculation. The variables included his career, his team's exposure, the integrity of his relationship with the JAG contact, and whatever he owed Marcus Vallon, which was not a quantifiable variable but was probably the one that weighted heaviest. "Her name is Commander Adele Firth," he said. "JAG. She's been outside the SOCOM chain for 2 years. She runs an independent operational review unit that was created specifically to handle cases where the standard IG pathway has a conflict of interest." He paused. "She's not someone you end run. She takes cases she decides to take, and she doesn't take cases she decides not to take. Then tell her what you know, Marin said. All of it. Don't manage the information. Give her everything and let her decide. Including your intercepts. Including the intercepts. He nodded once, slowly, the way decisions got made when they were real ones. I'll call her in 2 hours, when Selby is off-site. Call her from outside the facility, Marin said. Not from a hospital line. What? She went back to Drum at the 4-hour mark, which was 2 hours ahead of schedule because his pressure needed checking and because she wanted to know if he was stable enough to be moved if it came to that. The answer to the first question was yes, holding adequately. The answer to the second question was a more complicated yes. He could be moved, but not far and not fast, and any movement that didn't account for the potential for the suture line to stress under physical exertion was going to create a problem she couldn't manage in a supply corridor. He was more alert than she'd expected, sitting straighter. The gray quality in his skin had improved to something closer to pale, which was a meaningful distinction. You should eat something, she said. I'm not hungry. You've lost blood and you're running on adrenaline. The adrenaline is going to metabolize faster than you expect. She looked at him steadily. When it does, your assessment of your own functional capacity is going to be wrong. Eat something. He ate half a protein bar that Wynn produced from somewhere with the resigned compliance of a man who recognized he was being managed and had decided to let it happen. The person who contacted you, Marin said while she checked his pressure dressing. The one who showed you the communication log. Are they in a position to corroborate directly? No, Drum said. They're inside, deep inside. They've been building the case for 2 years and they have enough to bring to an independent review, but they can't be the one to initiate it without burning their position. So they're the source that can't be named. For now. He paused. If an independent review gets far enough along, they come forward, but they need the process to start from outside. From us, Marin said. From something that can't be buried, he said. The intercepts plus the communication log, those two pieces don't have a human source attached to them. They're signal records. They stand on their own. She smoothed the edge of the dressing and straightened up. Commander Voss is contacting a JAG officer tonight, someone outside the SOCOM chain. Drum absorbed this. Firth? She looked at him. You know her. By reputation, she's the right call. He paused. She's also the call that Wick has been watching for. The moment Firth is in play, he'll know the review is serious. I know. He'll accelerate. I know that too, Marin said. Which is why I need you to do something that's going to feel counterintuitive. He waited. Tomorrow morning, she said, I want you to go through official admissions. The look he gave her was the look of a man who had just been told to do the thing that would most effectively announce his location to the people currently trying to manage his location. Hear me out, she said. Right now you're invisible, which feels like protection. But you're also unregistered, which means if something happens to you, if someone from Selby's network locates this corridor, you don't exist in this facility. There's no record, no accountability. She looked at him steadily. The moment you're in the system, you're in a federal medical facility under a record. That's a different kind of protection. Anything that happens to you officially happens inside a documented chain of custody. Drum was quiet for a long moment. You're using the paperwork as armor. I'm using the paperwork as what it is, she said. A record that has to be accounted for. He thought about it. She could see him working through the implications, not just the safety logic, but the strategic one, the way that visibility, in certain specific circumstances, was more defensible than concealment. All right, he said. She left Wynn with him and went back to the main floor. What? At 6:47 in the evening, with the day shift winding down and the night nursing team beginning their handoff, Kurt Selby appeared at the nursing station and asked to speak with the charge nurse about reviewing staff assignment records for the trauma recovery unit, Petra Dumont, who was filling out end-of-shift documentation and running on her second cup of coffee, and a specific brand of patients that came from years of managing bureaucratic interference in clinical environments, asked him to produce his authorization. He produced a contractor ID and a document that Petra examined for approximately 10 seconds before handing it back. That authorizes you to review facility operational records through the administrative office, she said. Nursing staff assignment records are medical personnel documents. They fall under a separate privacy classification. You'll need a judge advocate authorization to access them. Selby looked at her with the expression of someone unaccustomed to being told no by someone who wasn't going to be moved by the expression. "This is a matter of security compliance review," he said. "Then I'd suggest contacting the facility JAG liaison and getting the appropriate paperwork," Petra said. "We'll be happy to cooperate with a properly authorized request." Marin was standing at the medication cart 8 feet away, entering documentation, and did not look up. Selby said something else. Petra gave him the same answer in different words. He left. Petra looked over at Marin. "Security compliance review," Petra said, in the tone she used when something did not merit further discussion. Marin said. "You want to tell me why a SOCOM contractor is interested in nursing staff assignments?" "Not particularly," Marin said, for the second time that day. Petra looked at her for a moment, then looked back at her documentation. "Night shift is in. Go home." Marin didn't go home. She went to the locker room, changed out of her scrubs into the civilian clothes she kept in her locker, put the storage case in the interior pocket of her jacket, and sat on the bench in the empty locker room for 4 minutes. She was not panicking. She was doing the thing she had learned, slowly, imperfectly, across a decade of situations that required it, which was to stay completely still when there was nothing useful to do with movement, to let the information settle into its correct positions, to not confuse activity with progress. What she had, the storage case. Her 3 intercepts in a secured location 40 minutes from the hospital, a lockbox in the closet of the apartment she rented, under a month-to-month lease with a landlord who asked no questions, Drum's account, Voss's willingness to contact Firth, the knowledge that Selby was at the facility and had been for at least 3 days and had hit a procedural wall at the nursing records. What she didn't have? A timeline. Any certainty about how quickly Selby could get the authorization Petra had blocked. Any guarantee that Firth would take the case. Any control over the inside source that Drum had described. The person 2 years into building a case from within who needed the external process to start before they could come forward. She sat with the asymmetry of it for 4 minutes. Then she stood up, put her jacket on, and walked out of the locker room. The east corridor was quiet. The night team had taken over the main floor. She went to the staging area, which was semi-lit, the overhead fluorescence on a motion sensor that had clicked off, and she could see by the ambient light from the window that Shadow was awake in his crate and tracking her before she was fully through the door. She sat down on the floor next to the crate, not touching it, just near. She did this because she was tired and because the dog was a fixed point, and fixed points were useful when a large number of variables were in motion. It was not sentimental. Or maybe it was, slightly, and she was too tired to care. Shadow pressed his nose to the crate mesh nearest her and held it there. "I know," she said quietly. "Me too." She heard the door behind her and turned. Voss was in the doorway. He looked at her on the floor next to the crate with an expression that processed what it was seeing without commentary. "I reached Firth," he said. Marin stood up. "She's already aware of the case," Voss said. "That's the thing. She already knew. She's had it on her docket for 8 months. She's been waiting for an initiating event that could function as independent external corroboration because everything she has comes from inside." He paused. "She's been in contact with the same source Drum described. The pieces connected. The inside source brought the case to Firth and then separately contacted Drum," Marin said. "2 parallel tracks," Voss said, "in case one of them got compromised." "It's a good construction," she said. "You don't put all your evidence in one chain." "Firth is driving from Portland tonight," Voss said. "She'll be here by midnight." Marin nodded. "She wants the intercepts," Voss said, "and the storage case. Combined with what she has," she said. He stopped, started again. "She said it's enough to initiate a formal proceeding that WIC cannot redirect. The threshold for independent review authority bypasses his tier entirely." "Then we need the intercepts," Marin said. "They're at my apartment. I'll send 2 of my people with you." "No," she said. "1 person in a non-military vehicle. 2 operators accompanying a civilian nurse at night draws more attention than the errand warrants." She looked at him. "Send Win. He moves quietly, and he doesn't look like what he is yet." Voss almost said something about that. She could see the reflexive response forming and then being set aside in favor of the accurate assessment that she was right. "Fine. Win in a vehicle from the civilian fleet. 40 minutes out, 40 minutes back," she said. "We'll be here before Firth arrives." She was at the door when Voss said her name. Not Marin. The other one. The designation from the operational record. The two-letter call sign that Marcus had used, that her unit had used, that nobody had used in 5 years. She stopped. For what it's worth, Voss said, Marcus talked about you the way people talk about the person they'd most want beside them in the worst situation they could imagine. He paused. I thought you should know that. Whatever happens with Firth in the review, I thought you should know that before any of it. She stood in the doorway for a moment with her back to him. He was the same, she said, for whatever that's worth back. She walked out into the corridor. She and Wynne took a gray civilian sedan from the secondary lot, the kind of vehicle that was specifically unremarkable, and they were 6 minutes out from the facility on the coast highway, when Wynne, who had been quiet in the way of someone exercising restraint rather than having nothing to say, spoke. There's a vehicle, he said. Black SUV. It's been behind us since the main road junction. She checked the side mirror. He was right. It was 2 car lengths back, no lights distinguishing it, maintaining a consistent interval. Don't change speed, she said. Copy. She thought about the lockbox in her closet, the 3 intercepts inside it, the storage case in her jacket pocket, the convergence of all of it at a point in time that was either exactly right or exactly wrong, and the variable that would determine which was now behind them in a black SUV on a coast highway at 20 to 7 in the evening. Wynne, she said, yeah. Have you ever had to make a decision where the safe choice and the right choice were different things? He was quiet for a beat. Yeah, he said. Once. What did you do? I made the right choice, he said. Got my ass handed to me for about 3 months afterward. A pause. Commander Voss backed me. She looked at the side mirror. The SUV held its interval precisely, not closing, not dropping back, holding, waiting to see where they were going. She took out her phone and called Voss. He picked up in 2 rings. We have a tail, she said. Black SUV, coast highway. We're 11 minutes from my apartment. Turn around, Voss said immediately. No, she said. If I turn around, I don't have the intercepts. If I don't have the intercepts, Firth doesn't have what she needs. Marin, the intercepts and the storage case together constitute a complete record, she said. Separately, they're challengeable. You know that. She watched the SUV in the mirror. Keep this line open. If the SUV moves, you'll know. Silence on Voss's end, then, I'm sending the other 2. Tell them to come in from the north approach, she said, not the main road. She lowered the phone and looked at Wynne. Drive normally, she said. Don't slow down, don't speed up. What do I do when we get there? Stay with the vehicle, she said. Engine running. He nodded once. His hands on the wheel were steady, and she made a note of that. The specific quality of someone who had been in situations where steadiness was a choice rather than a default. They drove. The coast highway was dark on both sides, the Pacific hidden somewhere to the west behind the cliff edge, the inland hills dark to the east. A clean, empty stretch of road between the hospital and the town, the kind of geography that offered very little in the way of options and a great deal in the way of exposure. 11 minutes to the apartment. The SUV held its interval. She was watching the mirror when she saw the second pair of headlights appear. Not behind them. Coming from a side road 3/4 of a mile ahead. A vehicle pulling onto the highway from the inland access road, positioning itself ahead of them rather than behind. We have a second vehicle, Wynne said, because he'd seen it too. Marin looked at the road ahead. Then the mirror. Then the road ahead. They were boxed. Don't stop, Marin said. Wynne's foot stayed steady on the accelerator. They're going to close the gap. Not yet. They're still measuring. She was watching the vehicle ahead. It had pulled onto the highway and matched their speed exactly, which was the move of people who wanted to establish a ceiling, not create a collision. They want to see if we panic. They want us to pull over voluntarily. And if we don't? Then they escalate, and that escalation happens on a public highway with an open phone line to a Navy commander who's already called a JAG officer. She kept her eyes forward. They don't want that. Selby's here on a dossier-building mandate. This, she gestured at the road, is improvised. Someone made a call they weren't fully authorized to make. Voss's voice came through the phone she'd left on the center console. Marin, my 2 are 8 minutes out from the north approach. What's your position? Coast Highway, mile marker 22. Two vehicles, one ahead, one behind. Neither has moved to close. Hold your speed. Holding. The vehicle ahead had its brake lights on for exactly 2 seconds, a tap, not a stop, and then resumed speed. It was either a mechanical glitch or a communication between the two vehicles, and she didn't think it was a mechanical glitch. They're talking to each other, Wynne said. Yes. What are they deciding? Whether we're worth the exposure, she said. The answer came 40 seconds later when the vehicle ahead began to slow, not aggressively, not a hard brake, but a gradual reduction that was designed to compress the space between them until the sedan had nowhere to go but stopped. The SUV behind maintained its interval, which meant the interval was shrinking. Options, Wynne said. It wasn't a question exactly, it was the word of someone running inventory. The access road at mile marker 24, she said. Gravel goes inland toward the ridge farms. They're in heavier vehicles than us, and gravel favors weight until it doesn't. She paused. It also takes us further from the apartment. Is there another way to the intercepts? She thought for 2 seconds. There wasn't another way to the intercepts, and the intercepts were the reason they were on this road. She could redirect to the hospital and arrive without what Firth needed, and the case Firth had been building for 8 months would remain one piece short of the threshold Voss had described. Keep going, she said. Marin, keep going, she said again. Call it, Voss. Keep going, Voss said through the phone. 6 minutes. The vehicle ahead dropped to 40 miles per hour. 38. The sedan's headlights were filling the rear window of the car in front of them now, close enough that she could see 2 silhouettes in the front seat and a third in the back. 3 people in the lead vehicle. She assumed 2 in the SUV, 5 total. When Voss's people reach the north approach, she said, the calculation changes. Right now they have 2 vehicles and no witnesses and a clear stretch of highway. In 6 minutes, they have a response team approaching from a direction they haven't accounted for. So we need to give them a reason to hold position for 6 minutes, Wynne said. Yes. He understood it before she said it, which she noted. The phone line. If Voss is audible to us, he's audible to anyone else in the vehicle. If Selby's people believe this is already on record, Wynne reached over and put the phone on speaker without being asked to. Voss's voice filled the sedan. Confirming north approach. ETA 5 minutes 40, Pearson Dunbar in a civilian truck. They'll come in without lights on the gravel stretch before the highway junction. It was possible Voss was saying this for operational coordination. It was also possible he understood what they needed him to say and was saying it for exactly that reason. Marin didn't know which. It didn't matter. The vehicle ahead slowed to 32 miles per hour. Then, without apparent reason, it accelerated. Not fast, just back to normal highway speed. The interval between them opened. Behind them, the SUV also fell back, 2 car lengths becoming 3, becoming 4. She let out a breath she'd been managing for approximately 4 minutes. They pulled back, Wynne said, with the specific restraint of someone who was not going to show relief until the situation was fully resolved. For now, she said. Drive. He drove. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a 6-unit building in a coastal neighborhood that had been affordable once and was becoming less so as the town grew northward. She'd chosen it for the external staircase, the lack of shared interior hallways, and a landlord who communicated entirely by text message and had come by in person exactly once in 3 years. Wynne parked on the street with the engine running, as instructed. She took the external stairs at a pace that was quick without being conspicuous, and was through the door in under 40 seconds. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning. She did the thing she always did when returning home, a quick visual sweep of the 3 rooms, not from paranoia exactly, but from the accumulated habit of someone who had spent years in environments where the difference between a space that had been entered and one that hadn't was something you could feel before you could name it. Nothing had been entered. The specific arrangement of objects she maintained without consciously thinking about it, the angle of the kitchen chair, the position of the entry table's single item, a ceramic bowl she never moved, was exactly right. She went to the closet. The lockbox was on the upper shelf behind a folded blanket, which was the least sophisticated concealment she owned, and the one she'd chosen deliberately, because sophisticated concealment of something in a domestic space was its own signal. The lockbox was a standard fireproof model with a mechanical key, and the key was on her keyring, and the keyring was in her jacket pocket. She opened it. 3 sealed evidence sleeves, each containing a printed signal intercept with timestamp, communication header, frequency data, and the specific authentication coding that made them verifiable as genuine archived signals rather than manufactured documents. She had printed them 5 years ago from the source data in a facility she no longer had access to, using a process that created a physical record rather than a digital one precisely because digital records were easier to make disappear. She put all 3 in the interior pocket of her jacket alongside the storage case. She locked the box, put it back, and was out of the apartment in under 3 minutes. Wynne had the vehicle in gear before she reached the bottom of the stairs. "The SUV is back," he said, "sitting at the end of the block, parked." She got in. "Go. They're going to follow us back." "I know," she said. She was already dialing Voss. "We have the intercepts. We're heading back. 1 vehicle is stationary at my building, likely to confirm my location for future reference. ETA 25 minutes. "Firth arrived 10 minutes ago," Voss said. "She's in the staging area." "Don't brief her until I'm there," Marin said. "She's already been briefed." "Voss, by me," he said. "Operationally. Nothing from the evidence. She's ready for you." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then, 25 minutes. She watched the SUV in the side mirror as they pulled away. It didn't follow immediately. It waited until they'd turned off the residential street before she saw its headlights come on in the mirror. But it was further back than it had been on the highway. More cautious. The Voss calculation, or the audible coordination through the phone speaker, had adjusted their risk assessment, and the adjustment showed in the distance they were keeping. She sat with the physical fact of what was in her jacket pocket. 6 pieces of paper and a small sealed case. A 5-year-old promise to a dead man that she'd never said out loud because saying it out loud would have meant admitting to herself that she was keeping it. She looked at the dark coast highway ahead of them and thought briefly about what Marcus Vallon had looked like in the last 4 minutes she'd known him, not in the cinematic way of dramatic recollection, but the specific and unglamorous way of actual memory. The cold, the poor light, the sound of the helicopter leaving, the fact that he'd told her to go and then spent the last of what he had making sure she knew he meant it. She had gone. She had spent 5 years trying to determine if going had been the right thing, and she had arrived at no conclusion she trusted, and she had decided that the absence of a conclusion was itself a kind of answer. You did the thing the situation required. You lived with the shape of it afterward. "You okay?" Wynne asked. He said it without looking at her, which she appreciated. "No," she said honestly. "But it's not the kind of not okay that changes anything." He nodded, in the way that people nodded when they understood that particular distinction. They drove back through the dark. Commander Adele Firth was not what Marin had expected, and Marin had spent enough time adjusting expectations that she'd gotten fairly good at not having them. But the mental model she'd been building of an independent JAG officer who'd been running a covert case for 8 months had assembled itself into someone with a different texture than the woman who stood in the staging area. Firth was 50, possibly 52. She was in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a well-worn field jacket that had probably been regulation at some point in its life. And she had the posture of someone who had learned to be comfortable taking up a specific amount of space and no more. Her hair was short and going silver, and she had the kind of face that had been in a lot of rooms and retained the evidence of that without being aged by it exactly. She looked at Marin when Marin walked through the door and said, "You're shorter than I expected from the Halvar file." "I've heard that before," Marin said. "Sit down," Firth said. "Both of you. We have a limited window, and I need to understand exactly what you have before I tell you what I have." Marin sat. She put the 3 evidence sleeves and the storage case on the table in front of Firth without preamble. Firth looked at them. She put on a pair of reading glasses and opened the first evidence sleeve with the care of someone who understood the material value of physical evidence that had been maintained for 5 years, and she read it completely before moving to the second. No one spoke while she read. Drum was in the corner in a borrowed chair, bandaged left side carefully positioned, watching with the expression of a man who had made his decision and was now in the part of the process where the decision was no longer his to manage. Combined with the internal sources documentation of the fabrication process, This establishes that Wick authorized the creation of false intelligence, transmitted it through an authenticated channel to manipulate an extraction decision, and subsequently supervised the construction of a mission report that obscured the manipulation. She put her hands flat on the table. That's not a procedural violation. That's a federal crime. Multiple counts. Marin watched Firth say this and felt the specific dissonance of a thing you had known for a very long time being said in a room by someone who had the authority to act on it. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like a door opening onto a hallway that still had a considerable amount of distance in it. "What happens now?" she said. "I file for independent review authority tonight," Firth said. "The threshold is already met. I've had the internal documentation for 2 months, which gave me probable cause for the filing, but I needed the external corroboration to meet the standard for bypassing SOCOM's tier of oversight. I have that now." She looked at Marin steadily. "The filing goes to the Deputy Inspector General's office directly. Wick is notified simultaneously, as required by procedure, but at that point he loses the ability to redirect the proceeding. The review authority is mine." "He'll move against it," Marin said. "He'll try," Firth said, "and that attempt will be documented as part of the proceeding. In cases of this classification, any interference with an independent review constitutes a separate chargeable offense." She almost smiled, and it was a small expression with a lot of history behind it. He can object, he can lawyer up, he can call every contact he has at JAG and the IG's office. None of those things stop the proceeding once the filing date exists. Starting the clock. Marin had said that to Voss hours ago, in a different context. The same logic, scaled. "The internal source," she said, "when do they come forward?" "When I request their testimony, which I'll do formally within the review proceeding. At that point, they're a protected witness under the military whistleblower statute." Firth paused. "They've been waiting for this for 2 years. I don't think they'll require much persuading." Voss had been quiet for several minutes, which was unusual. He said, "Marcus's service record." Firth looked at him. "Correcting the mission record is part of the proceeding. What happened to Master Sergeant Vallon on the Halvar corridor will be formally documented, with the fabricated intelligence identified as the determining factor in the extraction decision." She paused. "His record will reflect what he actually did. The sacrifice was real. The circumstances that created it were manufactured. Both of those things will be in the official record." Voss nodded, once. He looked at the table and not at anyone in the room, and Marin looked at the same table and gave him the privacy of the moment. Firth began organizing the documents. "I'm going to need formal statements from everyone in this room. Marin, yours will be the most extensive. You're the external corroborating source, and your account covers the entire span of the evidence chain." "I know," Marin said. "Your sealed service record will be part of the proceeding. It will be declassified within the scope of the review." "I know that too." Firth looked at her. "How do you feel about that?" Marin thought about the question. It was an unusual one for a JAG officer to ask. Most of them stayed in the lane of process and documentation and left the feeling questions to people whose job was feeling questions. "I feel like it's the right consequence," she said. "For all of it. The record correction, all of it." She paused. "I'd rather be a nurse in Oregon with a sealed file. But that stopped being an available option when Shadow walked around a corner and recognized me." Firth accepted this without editorial comment, which was the right response. It took 2 hours to get the preliminary statements. Marin's was first, then Drum's, then Voss's. Firth recorded and transcribed simultaneously with a system that created an authenticated time-stamped record at each step. The room was cold, and the coffee that someone had produced at some point went lukewarm and then cold, and nobody commented on it. At 11:47, Firth filed the independent review request from a secure uplink device she'd brought from Portland. She read the confirmation code aloud and wrote it in a physical log and had Voss and Marin each initial it as witnesses to the filing. "As of 11:47 tonight," she said, "the proceeding exists on record. Wick will receive formal notification at 0800 tomorrow through his office's secure channel." "What does he do between now and 0800? Wynne asked from his post near the door. It was the first thing he'd said in 2 hours. "Between now and 0800, Firth said. "He doesn't know yet." She closed the secure uplink. "Which is why I drove from Portland tonight instead of waiting for morning." The window. She'd wanted the filing date to exist before Wick had any possibility of preemptive interference. Marin understood the architecture of it. Firth had been doing this for 8 months with exactly this endpoint in mind, and the timing of tonight's drive had been calibrated to the hour. Kurt Selby, Marin said, will be identified in the proceeding as an agent conducting unauthorized surveillance at a federal medical facility, Firth said. I've already flagged his access credentials with the facility security office. A pause. He won't be back in the morning. Shadow had been awake through all of it, quiet in his crate, and as the room emptied, Drum being helped to a legitimate patient room now that the formal admissions Marin had arranged were in the system, Wynne and the other SEALs returning to their quarters, Firth securing her materials. Marin stayed in the staging area until it was just her and Voss and the dog. Get some sleep, Voss said. In a minute, she said. She was tired in a way that had a specific texture. The fatigue of having carried something heavy for a long distance and finally been allowed to set it down, which was not the same as rest. The weight left an impression. You knew where it had been. She sat down by the crate again. Shadow watched her with the patient attention of an animal that had learned to read long silences in people. He would have liked her, Marin said. Firth. He would have made her laugh by the end of the first meeting, and she would have pretended she hadn't. Voss said nothing. He sat in a chair somewhere behind her, and the room was quiet, and Shadow pressed his nose to the mesh and held it there. She let herself stay with it for a while. The specific temperature of that mountain night. The sound Marcus had made that was trying to be reassurance and wasn't quite. The way he'd kept his hand on Shadow's collar until he physically couldn't anymore. She didn't stay with it long. She'd learned the length of it. She stood up, put her hand flat against the crate mesh for a moment, and said goodnight to Voss, who was asleep in the chair with his head back and his mouth slightly open, which was undignified and entirely human, and she decided not to mention it. She drove herself home through the dark coast highway, which was empty now. No black SUVs, no managed intervals, just the road and the fog and the sound of the Pacific somewhere to the west. She slept 4 hours and was back at Harbor Reach by 6:15. The morning started the way mornings there usually started. Fog, equipment alarms, the overnight report on the hallway tablet. Fowler's slow bleed had been addressed in a procedure the previous evening. Reyes had achieved improved grip strength in the night assessment. 2 new admissions from a transport that had come in at 3 a.m. She was 40 minutes into rounds when Petra appeared beside her in the corridor with the expression she used when something had occurred that required information to be exchanged. There are people in the administrative wing, Petra said. Not Selby. Different people. More official. How many? 4 that I've seen. Judge advocate IDs. They've been in the administrator's office since before I arrived. Firth's procedural downstream. The review filing generated an automatic notification to the facility administrator that triggered a cooperation protocol, records access, space access, whatever the reviewing authority needed. It had started before the day shift arrived. They're with Commander Firth, Marin said. It's sanctioned. Petra looked at her. Are you going to tell me what's actually happening? Eventually, Marin said, when I can. Petra absorbed this with the characteristic pragmatism of someone who had worked in a military medical facility long enough to understand that there were categories of events she was not going to be briefed on in real time. Marin went back to rounds. She was in room 119 with one of the new admissions, a compound leg fracture, 24 years old, clearly furious about being horizontal, when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't have saved. She looked at it. The notification went to his office at 0800 as stated. He filed for a procedural block at 0812. The block was denied at 0844. He is now reported to be en route to Portland with legal counsel. His assistant contacted this office at 0819 to request postponement of any review proceedings for 48 hours pending legal consultation. Then a second message, same number, request denied. Proceeding continues on established timeline. She stood in the hallway outside room 119 and read both messages twice. 12 minutes, from notification to attempted block to denial. Firth had anticipated the block and had the denial prepared before the request arrived. 8 months of preparation, and she'd preloaded every counter move he had. Marin put her phone in her pocket. She was walking back toward the nursing station when the administrator's assistant, a young man named Price, who handled scheduling and was perpetually overwhelmed, came toward her at a pace that was just short of a run. "There's a call for you," he said, "in the administrator's office. They said it's urgent." "Who is it?" "I don't—" He caught his breath. "They said to tell you it's coming from the Deputy Inspector General's office. Direct line." She looked at him. He was nervous in the way of someone who understood that significant things were occurring and didn't know what his role in them was supposed to be. "Tell them I'll be there in 2 minutes," she said. She went back to Fowler's room first, checked his drain, made a notation. It took 90 seconds, and she did not let herself be hurried through it, because Fowler's drain mattered, and the call could wait 90 seconds. Then she went to the administrator's office. Firth was there, along with 2 of the JAG officers Petra had mentioned, and the administrator himself, a heavy-set man named Walcott, who looked like he'd been briefed on something at an hour that hadn't improved his morning. On the speakerphone was the Deputy Inspector General's office, confirmed by the seal on the call header visible on the conference room screen. Firth looked at Marin when she walked in. Something in her expression had changed from the previous night. Not relief exactly, because people like Firth didn't process in relief. Something more like the specific alertness of a case in motion. "Ms. Solis," the speaker said, a woman's voice, measured and formal. "I understand you're the primary external source in Commander Firth's proceeding." "Yes," Marin said. "We've completed a preliminary authentication review of the evidence submitted this morning. I'm calling to inform Commander Firth and all parties that the evidence meets the threshold for emergency declassification authority under the Independent Review Act, and that proceeding will be conducted under that authority effective immediately." Marin stood in the administrator's office and felt the thing she'd been waiting 5 years to feel, which was not dramatic and not cinematic, and was instead something very quiet and very tired, like a room finally going still after a long period of noise. "Additionally," the DIG's representative said, "I'm informing all parties that Deputy Director Harlan Wick submitted a formal objection to this proceeding at 0812 this morning, and that objection was denied under Section 14 of the Independent Review Act, which prohibits interference by any subject of a proceeding with the proceeding itself." A pause. "Deputy Director Wick has been formally notified that any further attempt to impede or delay this review will constitute a separate chargeable offense." Walcott, the administrator, was writing something on a notepad and had the expression of a man who had been a military bureaucrat long enough to understand that when the Deputy Inspector General called your facility directly, you wrote everything down. "Ms. Solis," the voice said, "we'll need your formal deposition within 72 hours. Commander Firth will coordinate the logistics." "Understood," Marin said. The call ended. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Firth said, "Wick's legal team filed a secondary motion at 0842. They're claiming the intercepts were illegally retained." "They were retained by a serving military medic during an active operation," Marin said. "The applicable statute was revised in 2019, Firth said. "I know, the motion will fail, but it tells us something useful." "He's already shifted strategy," Marin said. "He's abandoned the block approach and moved to evidence suppression," Firth said. "Which means he's accepted that the proceeding is happening and he's trying to limit the scope." She looked at Marin. "The intercepts are the piece that makes suppression difficult. They're physical documents with a 5-year chain of custody, authenticated at the source." "He knows that," Marin said. "He does," Firth agreed, "which is why his legal team's third filing at 0856 was a request for your nursing credentials to be reviewed by the state licensing board on the basis of alleged professional conduct violations during your time at Harbor Reach." The room shifted. Walcott looked up from his notepad. Marin heard the shape of it immediately. Not a genuine licensing concern, but a mechanism. If her credentials were under active review, her professional standing was in question. If her professional standing was in question, her reliability as a witness was challengeable. It wouldn't work. The filing was retaliatory and transparently so. But it would create noise. It would create a period of procedural uncertainty. It would put Harbor Reach in an uncomfortable position with respect to a civilian staff member currently involved in a federal proceeding. It was not a good move, but it was the move of someone running out of better ones. "On what basis?" Walcott said. His voice had an edge to it that Marin hadn't heard from him before. "They didn't specify in the filing," Firth said. The licensing board is required to acknowledge the complaint and open a review file. The review itself won't go anywhere. There's no evidentiary basis. But the open file is technically sufficient to create the appearance of contested credibility. Walcott set his pen down with more deliberateness than the action required. He looked at Marin. "I want to be clear," he said, "that Harbor Reach's position is that Ms. Solis is an exemplary member of our nursing staff with no conduct issues of any kind on record." He paused. "I'll be submitting that statement to the licensing board directly." Marin looked at him. He was not a man she'd had much interaction with. He was a bureaucrat, careful and institutional, and the fact that he'd said that plainly and immediately was something she hadn't anticipated. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back to his notepad. Firth was watching the exchange with the expression of someone cataloging useful data. "The licensing complaint changes your situation here," she said to Marin. "Not permanently, but for the duration of the proceeding, you're going to be under a level of scrutiny that—" The door opened. Petty Officer Wynne put his head into the room. He was looking at Marin specifically, with the expression she'd learned meant something clinical had gone wrong. "There's a situation on the recovery floor," he said. "Trauma response. 2 patients." He paused. "And the charge nurse is asking for you." Marin was already moving before he finished the sentence because whatever else was happening in that room, the proceedings, the filings, the slow, systematic dismantling of a deputy director's carefully constructed protection, 2 patients on the recovery floor were the thing that was happening right now, and right now was her job. She was 3 steps into the corridor when Wynne caught up with her. "It's not just the patients," he said low. "One of the responding physicians, the one who was called in for the emergency, he came from outside the facility. He's not on staff here." She slowed enough to look at him. "Petra's asking about his credentials," Wynne said. "She can't verify them, and he's already in with the patients." Marin didn't slow down again. She moved. She heard Petra's voice before she rounded the corner. Controlled, but clipped. The register Petra used when she was 3 seconds from making a decision she wasn't authorized to make and was going to make anyway. "I need your credentials verified before you continue," Petra was saying. "That's not optional." The man's voice was lower, smoother, the cadence of someone accustomed to having institutional authority do the work of persuasion for him. "I was called in by the facility administrator. Every second you delay." "Walcott didn't call you," Marin said. She walked through the recovery ward doors and took in the room in the 2 seconds it took to cross from the threshold to the nearest bed. 2 patients, both from Voss's unit, both in the early stages of their recovery, both awake and tracking the situation with the alert wariness of people trained to read rooms. The man standing between the beds was 50, maybe 53, in a white coat over civilian clothes, with a credential badge that was positioned at an angle that made it readable only if you stood directly in front of him. She stood directly in front of him. The name on the badge was Dr. William Karst. The credential issuer was a hospital system based in San Diego. The badge was real. She could see the holographic element. But the hospital system on it was not the one currently contracted to provide overflow physician support to Harbor Reach. "Dr. Karst," she said, "what's your relationship to this facility?" He looked at her with the specific assessment of a man deciding how much resistance she represented. "I was called in for a consult." "By whom?" "Administration." "I just came from the administrator's office," she said. He didn't mention it. Karst's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a millimeter of recalibration. "There may have been a miscommunication in the request chain." "There may have been," she agreed. She looked at the 2 patients. "How are you both?" The closer one, Sergeant Milo Breck, hip reconstruction, day 11, said, "He wanted to adjust my medication protocol. Said there was a conflict flagged by the pharmacy system." Marin looked at Breck's chart on the wall display. His medication protocol had not been flagged. She knew this because she'd reviewed it 40 minutes ago, and it was clean. She stepped to the medication cart beside his bed and confirmed what was or wasn't on it. The IV line was intact and running at the correct rate. Nothing had been added. Karst had been in the room less than 2 minutes before Petra flagged him. "Step out of this room," she said to Karst. "Ms. Nurse Solis," Petra said from the doorway, and her voice carried the specific authority of someone who had decided the line was here and was not moving. "And she asked you to step out." Karst stepped out. He did it with the careful composure of someone who had a secondary plan and was already running the calculation on when to deploy it. Marin stayed with the patients long enough to verify that both were physically uncompromised. Vitals, lines, the specific assessment of two men who were alert enough to tell her if something felt wrong. Neither reported anything administered or changed. She updated both charts with a timestamp notation documenting the incident. She came out into the corridor and found Wynne already beside Karst, not touching him, just present in the way that 6'2" of trained SEAL was present when it had decided to be present. Petra had a phone to her ear. "Security," she said into it. "I need verification of a physician credential at the recovery ward. Immediately." Karst looked at Marin. Something in his expression had let go of the pretense. "This isn't going to accomplish what you think it is," he said. "I think it's going to result in you leaving this facility," Marin said, "and a documented record of this interaction being added to Commander Firth's proceeding by end of day." She looked at him steadily. "Was that not the outcome you were predicting?" He didn't answer. Security arrived 4 minutes later. The credential verification took 9 minutes after that, during which Karst waited in the corridor with 2 security officers and Wynne and said nothing further. The verification confirmed that the badge was legitimately issued to a physician who was currently on scheduled leave from his home institution and had no formal relationship with Harbor Reach and had not been contacted by anyone at Harbor Reach to provide a consult. The badge was real. The pretext was not. Marin wrote the incident report herself, with timestamps, and sent it to Firth's secure channel before Karst had cleared the building. She went back to her patients. The formal notification of Harlan Wick's administrative suspension reached Harbor Reach at 2:17 that afternoon, transmitted through the Deputy Inspector General's office to Commander Firth, who informed the relevant parties in person rather than by message. It was not, Firth explained, a final adjudication that would take months, possibly longer, because federal proceedings involving someone at Wick's level moved through institutional processes that were deliberately slow and deliberately thorough, and the deliberateness was a feature rather than a flaw, even when it was frustrating. But administrative suspension meant he was removed from his operational role immediately, and his access to command-level communications and personnel decisions was suspended for the duration of the proceeding. His ability to send unverified physicians into federal medical facilities with false pretexts was, effectively, severed. Voss heard the news in the staging area and was quiet for a long time. "It's not enough," he said finally. "Not to anyone in particular." "No," Firth said. She'd come to deliver the notification in person, which Marin suspected was not standard JAG procedure, but was the kind of choice that people made when they understood the human dimensions of a case. It's the beginning of enough. The administrative suspension triggers an automatic referral to the Federal Criminal Division. The evidence we have now goes to prosecutors who will build a case for criminal charges. Fabricating military intelligence in a way that directly caused a service member's death. That's not an administrative matter. That's a prosecutorial one. Voss looked at the wall. "How long?" "For the criminal proceeding? 18 months minimum, possibly 2 years. And he walks around in the meantime. He walks around without a security clearance, without his position, and under the awareness of everyone in the organization that a federal criminal referral has been made with his name on it." Firth paused. "I've done this long enough to know that's not nothing. It's not immediate justice. But the people who work for him, who deferred to him, who made career calculations based on their proximity to him, they're making different calculations now." Voss said nothing. Drum, who was in a legitimate patient bed now, and had the improved color of someone who had received appropriate care for approximately 18 hours, said from across the room, "He put me in a position where I made a call that killed a good man, based on information he manufactured." He paused. "I've been carrying that for 5 years. I'll carry it for the rest of my life, regardless of what the record says." He looked at Voss. "But the record is going to say the right thing. That matters. Not to me. To him. To Marcus." Voss looked at Drum for a long moment. Something moved through his face that Marin didn't try to name because it was the kind of thing that didn't want to be named. "Yeah," Voss said. "It does." 3 days later, Marin gave her formal deposition to Commander Firth and 2 attorneys from the DIG's office in a conference room at Harbor Reach that smelled like stale air and whiteboard markers. It took 6 hours over 2 sessions. She described the Halvar corridor operation in the level of detail that she had not described to anyone in 5 years. and the describing of it was not cathartic in the way that popular understanding of catharsis suggested it would be. It was meticulous and specific and exhausting, and by the end of the second session, she had a headache behind her eyes and a tiredness in her chest that she recognized as the specific fatigue of having put a very heavy thing down with great care and attention and then stood up and looked at where it had been. The attorneys were thorough and professional. They asked clarifying questions without editorializing. They documented everything. When it was over, the lead attorney looked at her notes and then at Marin and said, "You retained this evidence for 5 years under circumstances that most people in your position would not have managed. The documentation is meticulous." "I had a specific reason to keep it," Marin said. "Can I ask what that reason was?" She thought about it. The honest answer was the only one worth giving. "I made a promise to someone who wasn't alive to hold me to it," she said. "I find those are the ones you keep most carefully." The attorney wrote something down. Marin didn't know what. The state licensing board's review of her credentials was formally dismissed 11 days after Wick's legal team filed the complaint. The dismissal cited zero evidentiary basis for any conduct concern and noted that the complaint appeared to have been filed in connection with an active federal proceeding, which made it subject to the same prohibitions on interference that had already been applied to Wick's other obstructive filings. Walcott's letter on behalf of Harbor Reach, which she had not read in advance and which Petra described to her as more emphatic than Walcott usually manages, was included in the dismissal record. She found out about the dismissal from Petra, who found out from the administrator's office, and the conversation took approximately 30 seconds. "Dismissed," Petra said. "Good," Marin said. "Is that all you're going to say about it?" Marin thought about it. "It was a nuisance filing by someone who was running out of legitimate options," she said. "The dismissal is the correct outcome of a baseless complaint. I don't know that it requires more than good." Petra looked at her with the expression she'd been deploying with increasing frequency over the past 2 weeks. The expression of someone reassembling their understanding of a person they thought they already understood. "Who are you?" Petra said. It was half genuine question, half something between respect and exasperation. "A nurse," Marin said, "who used to be something else." She went back to rounds. Wick was indicted on federal charges 4 months later. The indictment was public, which was unusual for cases with the classification level of the Halvar operation, but the DIG's office had determined that the public interest in the accountability of senior defense officials outweighed the classification concerns for the specific charges being brought. The charges were fabrication of military intelligence, abuse of command authority, obstruction of a federal investigation, and conduct unbecoming an officer. 4 counts in total, each carrying its own sentencing range. The inside source came forward as a protected witness the same week. Her name, when it finally appeared in the documented record, was Lieutenant Colonel Dana Searle, and she had been a senior analyst in the SOCOM Intelligence Division for 11 years. She had been building the evidentiary record of Wick's conduct for 2 of those years, at significant personal and professional risk, from a position close enough to the operation to see what was being done to the information that passed through it. Her testimony, combined with Marin's intercepts and Drum's account, and the communication log Drum had received, and the extensive documentation Firth had assembled, constituted a case that Wick's legal team spent 3 weeks looking for a way around before acknowledging, in the procedural language of experienced attorneys, that there wasn't one. Marin read about the indictment in the morning, on her phone, before her shift. She was sitting in her car in the Harbor Reach parking lot with the engine off and the Pacific fog still thick against the windshield. She read the document carefully because she was someone who read things carefully, and when she reached the section that described the specific charge related to the fabrication of intelligence during the Halvar corridor extraction, she read that section twice. She sat with her phone in her lap for a few minutes. The fog pressed against the windshield. Somewhere below the bluff, the ocean was doing what it always did, completely indifferent to the specific reckonings of human institutions and the 5-year timelines of evidence chains and the amount of time it took for the right thing to become the official thing. She got out of the car and went to work. Marcus Vallin's service record was formally corrected 6 weeks after the indictment. The correction classified his death as a direct consequence of a command-level intelligence fabrication and documented his actions during the Halvar corridor operation, the medical care he'd provided under fire, The extraction decisions he'd facilitated, the specific choices he'd made in the final 40 minutes, with the completeness and accuracy that the original suppressed report had denied him. His next of kin, a younger sister named Bev Vallon, who lived in Tucson and had spent 5 years believing what the official notification had told her, which was that her brother died in a combat incident under circumstances that couldn't be fully disclosed, was notified in person by Voss, who drove to Tucson himself and spent 4 hours with her. He called Marin afterward. It was the first time they'd spoken by phone rather than in person. She, Marin asked. Wrecked, he said, and glad, both at the same time. That sounds right. She asked about you, he said. I told her. I told her you were there, that you stayed until you couldn't stay anymore, and that everything that's happened in the past several months started with you deciding it was time to stop waiting. Marin looked out the window of her apartment at the coastal dark. That's a generous version of events. It's the accurate version, he said. The generous version would leave out the part where you drove down a coast highway at night with a tail and didn't blink. She almost smiled. I blinked internally. Sure, he said. Of course. They were quiet for a moment, in the way that two people could be quiet on the phone when they had a shared reference that didn't need to be filled in. Shadow's retiring, Voss said. They made the decision last week. He's 11. His hips aren't what they were. A pause. The evaluation process for retired canine placement it's more bureaucratic than it sounds. There's a ranked list of qualified candidates. Is there? Marin said. He chose you, Voss said simply. 3 separate assessment sessions, every time, like there was no other outcome he was willing to consider. She closed her eyes. The specific weight of that. The dog who had pressed his nose against her chest in a hospital corridor and refused to let 5 years be the end of something. Tell them yes, she said. Already did, Voss said. 2 days ago, actually. I was just waiting for a moment to tell you in a way that wasn't. I didn't want it to be a form. It's not a form, she said. No, he said. It's not. Shadow came to her on a Thursday, which was a day like any other except that it wasn't, and Voss drove him up from the transition facility in his personal truck and carried the dog's bed and 2 weeks of food in a manila envelope up the external staircase of her apartment building, with the slightly self-conscious efficiency of someone doing a thing that had emotional content and preferred to focus on the logistics. She stood in the doorway and watched Voss set the bed down in the corner she'd cleared and then straighten up and look around the apartment. Small, functional, evidence of someone who lived alone and had made a moderate peace with that. It's clean, he said. I wasn't expecting a visit, she said. I meant as a... Never mind. He rubbed the back of his neck. The manila envelope has his medical records, his training documentation, the transition paperwork. Okay. Shadow was already sitting next to the bed she'd cleared, looking at her with the specific expectation of a dog who considered this detail resolved and was now waiting for the next thing. She crouched down and put both hands on either side of his face, which was grayer around the muzzle than she'd let herself process before now, and looked at him directly in the way she'd learned he preferred. Hi, she said. Shadow pressed his forehead against hers. It was not a graceful moment. She wasn't expecting it, and she was still crouching, and she had to put a hand on the floor to keep her balance, and her eyes did something involuntary that she didn't try to stop, and it was the most undignified she'd been in years, and it didn't matter at all. Voss looked at the window. Marcus used to do that, he said quietly. That thing Shadow does. The forehead thing. Said he trained it in during recovery work. It's a grounding behavior for dogs with high-stress service histories. He paused. Said it also worked on people. It does, Marin said from the floor. She stayed there for a while. Voss stood at the window and said nothing else, which was the right thing. The trial was scheduled for 14 months after the indictment. Between the indictment and the trial, Wick's legal team filed 17 motions. 14 were denied. 2 were granted in modified form in ways that affected procedure but not substance. 1 was still pending at the time the trial date was set. Marin followed the procedural developments through Firth, who sent periodic updates with the terse precision of someone who communicated at the informational level appropriate to the recipient and had accurately assessed what level that was. She was not a party to the criminal proceeding. Her role was completed at the deposition, and the evidence she'd provided was now part of a federal record that didn't require her ongoing participation. Firth would call her if something required her attention. Otherwise, the machinery moved without her, which was exactly how it was supposed to work. She went to work. She did her rounds. Fowler was discharged on a Wednesday with a drain he no longer needed, and a gait he was unreasonably proud of given that it was still 3 months from being reliable. Reyes completed her occupational therapy milestone 3 weeks ahead of the projected timeline and sent Marin a text that said, "Only told you," with no punctuation, which Marin kept and did not respond to because the response she wanted to send was embarrassingly sincere. She trained Shadow on the harbor trail in the mornings before shifts. It was slower than he'd been in the operational photographs she'd looked at over 5 years of following from a careful distance. His hips were what they were, but he moved with the same specific quality of attention that she'd recognized in the hospital corridor, the quality of an animal that was paying more attention to you than to anything else in its environment. She found that she talked to him in the mornings, not constantly, not in the way people who needed a constant audience talk to their dogs. Occasionally, when something was worth saying to something that would listen without needing her to manage the impression she was making. She told him about the licensing board dismissal, which he was present for and therefore already aware of, but she told him anyway. She told him about Bev Vallon calling her, which happened 2 months after Voss's visit to Tucson, a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and went places that conversations between strangers who share a significant person usually eventually go, difficult and honest and necessary. She told him that she thought about Marcus differently now than she had for the past 5 years. Not with less weight, with more accuracy. The difference between carrying the distorted version of something and carrying the real version was not that the real version was lighter, it wasn't, but that it was the right shape. You could carry the right shape without the exhaustion of maintaining a story about it. Shadow trotted beside her on those mornings, and occasionally pressed his graying head against her leg, and she'd put her hand on his back, and they'd keep walking. Harlan Wick was convicted on 3 of 4 counts. 14 months after the indictment, following a trial that ran for 6 weeks and produced a documented record of 2,300 pages. The acquittal on the 4th count, conduct unbecoming an officer, which had the most ambiguous evidentiary standard, was the only partial outcome, and the 3 convictions carried sentences that the judge imposed without reduction. 8 years federal, stripped rank, forfeited pension, permanent bar from any federal employment or cleared position. The sentencing was covered by 3 national news organizations, each of which described the case in ways that were accurate in their broad outlines and incomplete in their specifics, which was how journalism about classified proceedings usually worked. None of them named Marin. Her deposition remained under the review's confidentiality provisions, as she had requested, as Firth had arranged. She read the sentencing report on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table, with Shadow's head in her lap and a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm while she was reading. She read it to the end, including the section that described the judge's statement, which noted that the defendant had caused a service member's death through a deliberate act of deception and had subsequently constructed an institutional cover that had persisted for 5 years, and that the sentence was intended to reflect the severity of those choices and their consequences. She put the phone down. Shadow looked up at her. "It's done," she said. He put his chin back on her knee. She drank the lukewarm coffee and sat with the specific texture of done, which was not triumphant, not clean, not the feeling that the shape of things had been restored to what it should have been, because the shape of things was what it was, and included Marcus not being alive and 5 years of carrying something heavy and a harbor trail that she now walked every morning with an 11-year-old dog with bad hips. Done meant the account was settled. Done meant that what was in the official record was now the truth, which was not the same as the truth being something that fixed anything, but was still worth the 5 years it had taken to arrive there. She thought it was worth the 5 years. She was still thinking about that when her phone rang. Voss. "Saw the news," he said. "Me too." "How are you?" She considered the question honestly. "Tired," she said. "Okay, both." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "Bev is... She called me this morning. She said she was going to plant something in her yard for Marcus." A pause. "She said she wanted to tell you that." Marin looked out the window. The fog had mostly cleared, which happened sometimes by mid-morning, The light on the water was the specific flat silver of the Pacific coast in winter. "Tell her that's the right idea," she said. After she hung up, she sat at the table for a while longer, not doing anything in particular. Shadow breathed steadily against her knee. Outside, the light moved on the water the way light did, regardless of anything. She was 32 years old and had been a combat medic, and was now a nurse, and had spent 5 years being both simultaneously in a way that only she had known, and the weight of that double life was gone now, fully gone, replaced by the simpler weight of being one thing in one place, with a clear record and a dog that chose her. It was not a small thing to be known accurately. She had spent so long being unknown, deliberately, necessarily, at great cost, that she had almost forgotten the specific quality of existing in a form that matched your record. The woman in the nursing station, and the woman in the deposition, and the woman in the Halvar corridor were all the same person, and now the document said so. And it was the kind of truth that you didn't know you were missing until you suddenly weren't missing it anymore. She finished her coffee. She clipped Shadow's lead. He stood immediately, because he always knew, and they went out down the external staircase and onto the harbor trail, walking into the winter light together. His gait was uneven, favoring the right hip in the specific way she'd learned to read, and she adjusted her pace to his without thinking about it. The way you adjusted to the people and animals you walked beside when you paid enough attention. The water was to their left, and the trail was mostly empty this early on a Saturday, and Shadow moved with the deliberate enjoyment of a dog who had worked hard for a long time and understood now that the working was finished and the mornings were his. She had been dismissed and doubted and buried in institutional silence. She had carried evidence that could have ended her career or her freedom for 5 years without anyone to share the weight with. She had been a woman that nobody in a hospital corridor saw clearly until a dog refused to pretend otherwise. And she had kept going, not because she was exceptional at keeping going, not because she had resources other people lacked, because the alternative was letting the wrong version of things stand, and she had decided, quietly and without announcement, that she was not willing to do that. That was the whole of it, really. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a woman who knew what the truth was and refused to forget it, even when forgetting would have been easier, even when carrying it cost more than she'd budgeted for, even when there were 5 years of mornings where she woke up and the account was still unsettled and the day still had to be lived. Shadow pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his back and they kept walking. The light came off the water and the fog continued to clear, and somewhere behind them, Harbor Reach sat on its bluff doing the work it did every day. And she would be back there Monday morning, and the patients would be the patients they were, and she would do what she was good at, which was showing up and paying attention and not flinching. She had learned, in the end, that the most dangerous thing about her had never been her training or her intercepts or her 5 years of careful preservation of inconvenient evidence. It was that she never stopped knowing who she was. Not when they dismissed her, not when they buried her record, not when they tried to reduce her to a footnote in someone else's account of what had happened on a mountain she had not left willingly. She knew who she was, and she kept knowing, and eventually the world caught up with what she'd known all along. Shadow walked beside her in the winter light, and it was enough, and it was real, and it was hers.